Hello and welcome back to Radio 2. Today we're starting with a new module. So we're looking at module 2.12 today. Something that we'll be looking at is tragedy and how to handle shows during those types of times and speciality shows, okay? And then tragedy and sensitive topics. And while that might have been one that you would have been so familiar with, and while that wouldn't have been one that you would have been so familiar with a year and a half ago, since COVID, I think we all have a much greater understanding of sensitive topic of tragedy and how radio changes with tragedy and with sensitive topics, okay, things like that. Let's start by looking at the first part of it. Why do we have speciality shows? What do they do? So in terms of speciality shows, they are extremely captivating to the point where we also refer to them as appointment listening, because that's when we tune in. We tune in especially to hear that specific feature. We might not listen to the radio the rest of the time or the rest of the day. So a speciality show usually refers to a time slot that's segmented to have a specific feature within that time, okay? Whether it's on a day-to-day basis or whether it's on a weekly basis. In terms of speciality shows, though, this could be a show specifically with certain types of music on it, or the show would be branded through its name to identify it as a speciality show. So here you can get different things using different interests or values or lifestyle elements, etc., as tools to target a specific audience. Okay, so in the context of radio broadcasting, if we look at speciality shows, they are there to target a specific type of listener. And I'm sure if you sit and start thinking about it, you can come up with many different types of speciality shows. Whether it be a weekly feature that speaks about new movies that have been released, whether it's a top 40 show, whether it's a top 20 show, so a music show, whether it's a local only show, whether it's an internationally based show, whether it's an arts and culture show or a show specifically about sport elements or a political show or a financial show, okay, whatever it is. Those are a couple of examples of the types of speciality shows that we get. We've previously looked at outside broadcasts with the different equipment types. We looked at how outside broadcasts have been done during COVID versus a massive big scale and who all the players are that are involved. What we're going to look at today, however, from an outside broadcast point of view is from the content part of it. So if you had interviews, how would you do your interviews? Would you not put interviews in simply because it's an outside broadcast? How does storytelling fit in with outside broadcast? And just what everything is that you can do to make a really great storytelling, to create a great story in terms of where storytelling fits in with outside broadcasts. Everything that you do needs to have that storytelling element to it. Remember that we spoke about this. It doesn't matter what it is. If you are a great storyteller, you will be a good presenter. Well, if you are a great storyteller, you're already well on your way to becoming a great presenter, meaning that all those tools that we are providing you with should be incorporated even in something like an outside broadcast. So let's start looking at outside broadcasts from a content point of view. If you want to follow along, we are looking at Next Level Radio from page 164 to 166. So not a lot of information, but again, very important information. So an OB or an outside broadcast. You would have all seen one of these, I hope, at some point, whether it's at a festival, whether it's at a launch of something, whether it's at an opening of a new store, whether it's at a rally, whether it's at a race, somewhere along the line, you would have seen an outside broadcast. And I'm hoping that you've seen different ones and seen that they can differ with different stages, with lots of speakers, or only a few speakers, or no speakers, or a little table versus the big whole setup and stage and everything. Or they could have been MCs, or they couldn't, or they would have been DJs, or maybe there wasn't. Okay, so there's all these different things, all these different types of outside broadcasts. At the end of the day, though, what is an outside broadcast? It's simply your show that's being done from a different venue to the studio where you usually do your show. So an outside broadcast is normally done in front of an audience. So an outside broadcast is normally done in front of an audience. And with today's technology, these broadcasts can be done almost anywhere in the world relatively easily and at quite a low cost. The outside broadcast is for listeners and audience members that are at the OB, as well as your audience members that are not at the outside broadcast. So the ones that are simply listening in their car or at work or at home or wherever it might be, you have two different audiences. The ones in front of you and around you at the event, and then the ones somewhere else listening to you. And you have to cater for both of these at the same time. If you execute for one and not the other, you're running the risk of isolating your audience and causing a massive tune out. So it's important that you remember both. So there are 10 rules that we're going to look at now to ensure that both your listeners and your audiences are catered for effectively. And that's really important. And we start by looking at the first one which is do your regular show, but better. Retain all of your regular features. So everything that would have been in your show in a normal day-to-day, keep those things. For instance, your benchmarks that you know are happening, keep them. Play the same amount of music as you usually would. No more, no less, okay? The same amount of music. Do your usual interactive contests, but play them on location with people standing there in front of you instead of on the phone. So if you had games, play the games with your live audience now. Remember, there's zero listenership benefit from hearing you getting a suntan. That's not why, if I'm sitting at home listening to you, I'm not going to care about that, okay? Because I'm not at the event where you are. Keep doing the same show the listeners at home love. Anyone who's a frequent listener to you will have an understanding of what you normally would do, so stick to that. Number 2, plan more. If you spend 4 hours a day on planning a show in the studio, plan to spend 6 for an outside broadcast, so an on-location show. Why? Because you're going to have many opportunities to create different and exciting bits of content, but these need to be well prepared and well thought through to ensure that they're exciting and that they engage and that they are relatable, but for both audiences. Okay, so you'll need to put in a little bit of extra planning to make sure that you are not excluding anyone from your outside broadcast. Number 3 there, it's a show, not an infomercial. If it's a paid for outside broadcast by a commercial partner, which a lot of them are, make sure that the commercial sales team define exactly what messages to be included in the broadcast. Add 1 or 2 add 1 or 2 special surprise and delight moments for the client, but don't make the whole outside broadcast all about your client, because your audience is simply going to tune out. So talk to them, ask them what it is that they want. So are there interviews involved? Are there different people that you need to speak with? How many content pieces are they expecting, etc., so that you can work around those. Number 4 there, record and edit all of your interviews. If you have an interview, don't get them to come down and stand next to you and do this whole interview while you're there, because firstly, you don't know how in control you are of the situation. The interview might be a lot longer than the interview might become a lot longer than it was supposed to be. There might be a lot of elements that the audience at home wouldn't really care about, meaning that you can stand losing them. So to avoid this and to avoid guests using up your airtime, okay, which, like I said, can cause your audience to lose interest, rather record and edit all of your interviews beforehand. because that leaves you in control and it leaves you to make sure how long the interview will be. All you do is you hook up a laptop with a basic audio recording and an editing program into the sound mixer at your remote location. Done. Okay. So even if it's an interview with the CFO or with whoever, if it's a commercial entity, you can pre-record it, edit it, put it on air. Number 5, get an audience. Make sure that the outside broadcast is set up in a place that has a high footfall, and viability. Scrap. Make sure that the outside broadcast is set up in a place that has a high footfall and visibility and can attract an audience. If your show is early in the morning, lure people with free breakfasts and prizes. Okay? Give out coffee. Make sure to get them involved. Also, hearing audience laughter adds a new dimension to your show for listeners. And then number 6, multiple mics are a must. Don't share your microphone with one of the characters or a guest. It changes the chemistry and impacts the delivery of the presentation. And then number 7 there, bring audio to the show. Record as much audio from the destination as possible because it enhances the show and it brings something different to the listening experience. So all these little tidbits and things, they work very well within your show. Okay, it's all elements that you can add. The next one is generate stories. So here's our storytelling. Use every opportunity you can to create content that delivers great stories about the adventure. Pay attention to what happens as you're packing, as you're driving to the airport, going through security, flying, getting lost on the way to a hotel, whatever, etc. Okay. Voice note yourself things that happen while you're on the trip and plan how to present them to your audience the next day. So generate stories from your everyday opportunities, okay, your everyday life, like we've said in the previous lessons. Number 9, don't stress about technical problems. Something always goes wrong at an outside broadcast. I have never been to an outside broadcast that didn't have something that happened, whether it's from a technical point of view or whether it's with the music or an interviewee or the marketing on that side. Something is going to go wrong. Be prepared for this and don't let it freak you out. Stay calm because losing your temper won't help you fix anything and it will affect the atmosphere of the show because remember, you're still doing your show. So regardless of what is going wrong, you still need to perform for your audience. So you still need to continue with what you are doing. And then lastly, have fun. If you will have fun, so will your listener, okay? And it's quite fun to do outside broadcasts, depending on where you are. And the people can be quite interesting. So just have fun with what you're doing. If we look at key outside broadcast points, number 1, do your regular show, but better. You should also be doing a better show because you now have 2 different sets of audiences. One that's listening for your regular show, one that's listening for the outside broadcast. Then number 3, it's a show, not an infomercial. Number 4, record and edit all interviews because that way you're in control about how much airtime you have. Number 5, get a live audience. Number 6, multi-mics are a must, so everyone should have their own microphone. You shouldn't have to share yours because it'll break the chemistry. Number 7, bring audio to the show. So get as many audio pieces from the event where you're broadcasting as you can because it'll bring a different element to your show. Number 8, generate stories. So bring those story moments, take stories from everywhere, okay? Take stories from your real life, bring it in, utilize them. Number 9, don't stress about a technical problem. And lastly, try to have fun, okay? Because these things can be quite fun. Speciality shows are shows that go against the grain of regular programming. They're different in their sound and their content to the rest of the shows on the radio station. So in other words, they are programmed differently. These can be specifically designed as a weekly or as a daily show. All these shows can happen in times of tragedy, specifically when radio stations, to reflect the mood of the community, deliberately modify their programming. The weekly or the daily speciality show could be created to cater for a slightly different core market or core target market of a radio station and to attract a different type of audience. Commercially, these shows are about bringing in different groups of people that wouldn't ordinarily be catered for through the normal programming. So for this specific lecture, we're going to be looking at one type of speciality show, and that's the type that are broadcast during tragedies or with sensitive topics. So probably one of the biggest examples of tragedy radio within South Africa specifically, what happened on 5 December 2013. So that's the day that South African broadcasters prepared for quite a while prior to that, but one that I think we were all hoping would never take place, and that was the death of Nelson Mandela. I'm sure we can all picture exactly where we were when we heard the news. I remember I still had to go and DJ an event that afternoon, and it was probably the most somber DJ session I've ever had. That was the moment in which radio stations across the country got to throw out the format book, okay? They could change their format completely, the music policies, everything changed. The country was in mourning, and it was the job of every radio station to capture that national mood. Well, if we look at what the different types of radio stations did, 5FM also almost became a rhythmic ambient station, and 947 on the other side started playing very somber adult contemporary music. Most radio stations had imaging packages and audio on standby, but it wasn't this aspect that made radio so brilliant over this time. It was the fact that every presenter and every caller became vulnerable, intimate, they became real. It was an incredible few days in which radio showed that they could be the greatest companion and that it had the ability to truly connect with people. On this day, South African broadcasters learned how they could become the go-to medium when tragedy hits. Let's look at these couple of broadcasting days, and we can use them as a blueprint going forward. So when tragedy strikes again and when there's a sensitive topic that can come up, radio should become the go-to companion, okay? So South African radio should become South African listeners or citizens' go-to companion. And a little bit later on, we're going to look at COVID, because I think COVID is a great example of how we did this, how we became South Africa's go-to companion. So, but with regards to Nelson Mandela's death, firstly, the South African broadcasting had the opportunity to truly reflect the mood of the country. They took callers, they allowed them to cry, they allowed them to share their intimate emotions. When other tragedies hit or sensitive topics arise, allow your listeners to be open and honest and to share their experiences and their feelings with you. During this time, music stations didn't leave the news to the news stations. This was one of those strange times when everything kind of came together, again, similar to COVID. They integrated it into their programming and gave listeners all of the information that they needed. Music stations were teaming up with news partners to make sure that the news was credible and reliable. Radio stations reacted quickly and took charge of the situation. Many of them took it upon themselves to organize stories. Take note of this approach and be the station that takes action and helps where they can. Music radio is in the perfect position to bring listeners together through the power of music. What happens in these times is you should be throwing out the usual playlist and reflect the mood through song. Presenters during this time were real and vulnerable. but it made it about the listeners and not about them, okay? The nation turned to the radio for information about the events after Mandela's passing, and they were the shoulder to cry on. Everything was focused on the listeners, not the presenters. It's crucial in such times that to be there for listeners, emotionally and to reflect their experiences. This is the time for very sensitive topics. Presenters should allow their communities to reflect on how they feel, to emphasize. Presenters should not make these moments about them, it's about your listener. If radio stations and presenters can represent everything that broadcasters were representing during this difficult time, we as an industry can ensure that we will dominate the music mix when tragedy hits. Another example, taking us back a few years. In 2012, after a school shooting took place in Connecticut in the United States, broadcaster Cliff Dumas wrote an online article titled, "A Tragedy Has Happened. How do you handle it on your show?" In this article, he provided presenters with a thorough 9-point plan to dealing with tragedy. You should be drawing on this for inspiration to make sure that radio stays connected during difficult times. So we're going to look at those steps and then think about COVID. How did the radio station programming change? What happened? With regards to these 9 steps, however, don't just report on events, but feel them, because your audience will be feeling them. It's okay to show vulnerability and to reflect the mood of your listeners. Make recordings on the street of locals. Ask what they saw, what they heard, how they are feeling. If the tragedy took place somewhere else in the country, localize it by reaching out to a local school and ask them how the events in the news will change protocols. This is a great example of how to connect with your listeners, get their voices on air and make it about them. Tragedies allow presenters and shows to step out of their content comfort zones and to discuss what else can be done to add layers to the content. Can the show book an expert or find an eyewitness, police, firefighter, politicians, etc., to comment on the events? Get these kinds of people on air to bring across the different angles for listeners. If the show is aimed at parents, ask how parents can explain the events to their children. Open up debates and ask the hard questions about policy and so on. In a more in-depth show, a gun control debate might take place, although most shows will probably want to rather avoid such a controversial topic. When it comes to finding a personal way to deal with tragedies that have multiple casualties, the show could look into who were the people that lost their lives in an attempt to put a human face on these victims. Radio stations must do everything that they can to help their communities. They can set up a fund sponsored by the station and in the name of the victims. Inquire whether blood donations are needed, for example. The station should take the lead and help where it can. Music radio stations have access to artists, so the station could consider approaching artists and arranging a concert fundraiser. Finally, and to reiterate, remember to allow your audience to share their feelings on air and on your social media. Reflect the compassion, the fear, the anger of your audience. Be real, be vulnerable, and be there for your listeners. So what started happening with us last year when we went into lockdown? The world was thrown into a panic. We were thrown into a panic. Okay? Radio was thrown into a panic. Suddenly, we all had to make overnight changes to the way things have been done. Okay? People weren't listening the exact same times as they normally were. You were now at home, okay? Maybe you were stuck alone at home. So everything just kind of changed overnight for us. Meaning that the radio industry was one of the industries that had to very quickly adapt and change. And people started thinking about how they would reach their core customers during the COVID pandemic. radio became an effective media choice during COVID because it's on 24/7, 7 days a week, news, they all have news or talk programs. And we saw quite an increase in the numbers of listeners seeking daily information on the course of the pandemic. We all wanted to know what is happening. How is it affecting me? That's the biggest thing of this. It affected each and every one of us. So we all wanted information. Radio is even more effective during a crisis because radio provides a distribution platform for anything, whether it's PR, whether it's marketing, whether you just needed to get the word out there or create brand awareness so that people don't forget about you. Radio was used. And what happened with regards to the listenership? The listenership went up, it increased. The media consumption increased, okay? Yes, the advertising went down, but the media consumption went up because people turned to radio, because radio was like comfort food. We know that radio has always proved to be the medium that adapts very easily to crises or any crisis situation. If you look back throughout history, at times where there's been major natural disasters or previous health emergencies, radio has always played a leading role, thanks to the fact that it's such an easily accessible media. And I'm talking to you, I'm connecting with you, so I am your connection. So these were the interim data releases that came out for Jan to March. There's going to be another one that's coming out now within this week for March to May. But here we can see what were people listening to. They were listening because they enjoyed the talk shows. Okay, this is new for us. So we can see that during a crisis, people turn to the talk shows and to information, okay? It kept people company. So the radio was there to keep you company. So during this time of crisis, I turned to my radio as company to be informed about the news. Everything leads back to we need you as the radio station to provide us with the necessary information that we need to be our safety net in these times and to be constant. Okay, so radio stations had to step up and change their formats and bring in a lot more talk radio or bring in a lot more talk links and a lot more discussions around COVID and bring in the experts, tell us what is happening. And that's what we can see. We can see it within these numbers. It's a really interesting time in the fact of not only can I teach you about what to do within a crisis, but we can show you because it's currently happening. So you can hear what you've been listening to the last year on the radio, see the innovation that came in, because suddenly we had to innovate overnight. We had to send presenters home to go and broadcast from home, okay? Everything had to be adapted. You listened to DJs, to the hosts, so for shows, to know what is going on locally, okay? The weather, we wanted to know what the weather was. To get in a better mood, we found ourselves in a very weird space when it came to our mental health. With regards to mental health, people went through a very big dip, okay? So we listened to try and get into a better mood. To sports. Wasn't a lot of sports happening, but you could listen to some sport, yeah. So some people listened to music, and then because it was free and music surprises. So these were the biggest ones, but by far the highest here, talk shows kept me company, to be informed about the news, to listen to what the DJs or the hosts are saying, what is going on locally. That is why people listened to the radio, or this is why people listened to the radio during COVID. We might be going through a time with a lot of tragedies and definitely still sensitive topics, okay, with regards to emotions and what you as a listener would want from a radio station. And this is going to continue for we don't know how long, okay? We're not sure how long before things start going back to normal. But at the end of the day, it's important to realize that radio is there for you. So if we go back to the slides, don't just report on the events, but feel them, get involved with it, okay? Your audience will also be involved, as we can see. Make recordings on the streets. Ask what people were feeling, what they're hearing. Step outside of your comfort zone. Discuss what can be done. What can you do? How can you add extra layers to content now? Open up debates. Ask those hard conversations that need to be had. Find a personal way to deal with the tragedies. Assist your communities where you can, okay? And ask your listeners to share their feelings. This is an emotive time, so get them involved emotively. So that's from a COVID point of view, and I'm quite sure we can continue this conversation. But just briefly again, speciality shows. This is the show that you will specifically tune in for. So it's called appointment listening. They sound different and their content would be a little bit different to the rest of the shows on the radio station because they are programmed differently. This can be a daily show or a weekly show, but it will happen at the same time. So if we were to sum up what we have been looking at, we've been looking at the basic principles of radio programming and content creation. An important point to remember is that the information set out is that the information that we've looked at in the last couple of lessons is there not only for a presenter, but it's useful for a programmer, program manager, content producer, content creator, anything to do with content. So the big thing to get out of this is that you need to put in the hours, okay? Into your craft. Play with the ideas. Find what works for you. No one can create great content by simply reading or simply taking in what has been said. Remember, fantastic stories can be created by almost anyone who loves to work hard, entertain, and engage with people. But for now, that brings me to the end of this lecture, so I'll see you in the next one. Bye.